Alina, what are you making us?
Did you say my name?
Yeah, I asked what you're making us.
Oh, coffee. But it's like it almost started to boil over because it's in the microwave. So there it is. So I freaked out.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Awesome. The sun is shining, even though it feels like winter outside, but the sun is out, so that's a good thing. So just a couple reminders as we're going forward. Quiz 2 is open right now, closes Sunday at midnight, and then also don't forget about the asynchronous lab discussion forum for this week that is also due by Sunday at midnight. And then for your planning, just a reminder, next week we will go back to Tuesday, Thursday lab. And that's where y'all be showing off your fantastic things that you made with the splinting material that got sent to you. That's all the reminders I have right now. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we get started?
When looking at the not the rubric, I guess the rubric for the inclusivity assignment, how long do you want that paper? The paper that goes along with it, like, do you not want it extensive? Do you want it long?
I don't want it long.
Okay.
I don't want it extensive. Yeah, concise would be good. I don't know because I haven't done it before, so I don't know what to say, like how much, but I definitely would say no longer than, I would say 3 to 5 pages maybe would make sense to me. Try to keep it in there to that extent. If that sounds good to everybody. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, so today the plan is we do have an article presentation and we'll start with that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about adaptations and AT from a leisure and play standpoint. It'll be, I'm hoping, a short lecture. There's a lot of information on the PowerPoint, but I'm not going to go over all of the details information. And a lot of the details are sort of for your information, specifics. It's just really interesting information, but not necessarily information that, we need to specifically go over in class. So I'll just go through the PowerPoint and sort of point out the important things from like maybe an exam standpoint. But I do think the adaptations and AT from the leisure play sort of Paralympics, Special Olympics perspective is really super interesting. So that's why I have a lot of that information on there for you, because if you have ever watched the Special Olympics or watched Paralympics, it's really cool to watch. And the Paralympics was supposed to be in Tokyo this year in 2020, just like the Olympics. So Paralympics goes along with the actual Olympics at the same time, but who knows what's going to happen with that now. I was going to tell y'all to watch it this year. If you have never watched the Paralympics, it's super interesting to watch, but I think that's going to end up not happening this year. So anyway, so we'll go ahead. We have Jess and Sarah and Virginia with their article presentation. Take it away, guys.
I think you have to allow sharing.
Sorry, I keep forgetting about that. Okay. Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so our article was titled Three Students with Developmental Disabilities Learn to Operate an iPod to Access Age-Appropriate Environment Video or Entertainment Videos. Wow.
Oops, hold on. Okay.
So the problem or questions that were being addressed in the study, I have a couple quotes. So students with developmental disabilities have impairments that may prevent them from learning age-appropriate leisure skills when compared to their typically developing peers. So the authors really addressed how students with developmental disabilities may lack the necessary skills or opportunities to engage in the same leisure activities as their peers. And they really stress the importance of leisure and recreation for development and quality of life, and how it can have a positive effect on their social, environment, or emotional, physical and cognitive health. And they also stated that development of age-appropriate leisure skills could be seen to be an important educational objective for many young people with developmental disabilities. And they stressed that existing research, like what was currently existing before they did this, focused on supplying leisure opportunities for students with developmental disabilities, but they really wanted to focus on teaching the skills to engage in leisure activities that already existed. And then the hypothesis or research question that they were focusing on during the study was portable multimedia devices such as the iPod Touch may provide them, students with developmental disabilities, with a useful tool for accessing age-appropriate leisure material. So the study's aim was to examine whether students with developmental disabilities could learn to self-operate an iPod Touch to watch entertaining videos with video modeling and response prompting. And they wanted to address the question as to whether or not it was feasible to teach the three students with developmental disabilities to use the iPod independently to watch entertainment videos. And their goal at the end was to provide them with the skills needed to independently engage in leisure activities.
Okay, before I start, I just got kicked off of Zoom, so can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. All right, so there was 3 participants in the study, Sarah, Mary, and Jim, ranging from 15 to 19, and they all have a severe intellectual disability with one other diagnosis. So Sarah has epilepsy, and they said she has good visual and motor skills, and she can understand simple commands, but where she struggles is having age-appropriate conversation. And Mary also has her intellectual disability in CP. So with her, her motor skills are somewhat affected. And Jim has his intellectual disability in Klinefelter syndrome. And so with this, he can understand simple commands, but he has a small vocabulary and he'll rarely talk unless he's prompted to do so. So they all attended a public school where they were in a classroom with 5 students with their disabilities catered to. And so they picked these 3 students because they all have a similar cognitive ability and they all have minimal experience with an iPod, but they would benefit from using it.
So for the procedure, they used different phases to test if the learning the iPod was successful. So the first one was very client-centered. That was the questionnaire that just asked the kids if they were interested in using an iPod in the first place, what kind of videos they like to watch, and how they would want to learn. So they could choose to learn from instructions or physical prompts or looking at pictures. And they all chose to use a video that would show them how to do the steps of the iPod. So for baseline 1, they were given a prompt. So can you turn on the on button of the iPod? And they had 10 seconds to do this prompt. And then they were given up to 2 minutes to try to figure it out until the whole task was just ended. For baseline 2, they were given 10 seconds per step. So first, can you turn on the iPod? If they couldn't do this first step, the researcher would turn around and do the step behind their back so they couldn't see how to do it. And then they would just continue on to try to do the next step. So they were given more opportunity to try each step of using the iPod. And then the intervention phase was when that video modeling and prompting was introduced that Virginia mentioned. So that was a 38-second video, and it involved least to most prompting. So what that means is they had 10 seconds again to try to do a step of the iPod. If they couldn't figure out that step in the 10 seconds, they were either given a verbal prompt, so can you push the button? If they couldn't do that still, they were given a gesture, so pointing to the button. And then if they still couldn't figure it out, they'd be given physical hand-over-hand assistance. So it's kind of just increasing that assist level. And then they had a video phasing or video fading phase. So once they were competent in the iPod use, the video would be taken away to see if they could still do the steps without watching it. And then there was this interesting symbol discrimination phase, and that was just to make sure that the kids weren't just memorizing where the buttons were on the iPod. They had to actually be able to identify the buttons if they were rearranged or if the order of the buttons were rearranged. And then there was a follow-up phase. And then just for the timeline, so the sessions were 2 times a week in the morning, and they could only use the iPod during these sessions, so that made sure that they weren't learning by trial and error outside of the classroom. And then they were allowed as many sessions as they needed until they felt competent in the iPod use. So then to analyze the data, they used a delayed multi-probe design. So that means is delayed successive intervals to see if learning was occurring. So like I said, the baseline, intervention, fading, and then follow-up. And then they used a task analysis to actually measure, to be used as the dependent variable. So like we learned last semester, they broke down using an iPod into 7 different steps, and then the number of steps that the kids could complete independently. So that was considered independent if they were without prompts. That would be considered a successful step. And then just to keep their variables consistent in order to analyze the data, they had the controlled variables of that sequence from baseline to fading, and then all the kids had the same reinforcement. So that was being able to choose the video that they wanted and being praised when they did it correctly. So here's the results. So again, they show the maximum number of steps that the kids were able to complete out of that task analysis. So in the baseline phases, they each had about 1 to 2 steps that they could do independently. Then once they were given the video modeling and prompting, they got up to 6 or 7. The video fading, they all reached 7 steps, so 100%. And then they all passed that icon discrimination successfully. And then in the follow-up, they were all able to retain either 100% or no lower than 80%. And then just one thing to note for their assist level, Mary had the most assist with those physical prompts. But like Sarah said, she had CP, so it wasn't that she didn't understand the iPod, she just physically could not hold the iPod, so that's what held her back with her assist level. And then here's just a graph showing that progression of them learning more from after the video modeling.
So the author's conclusions, we said that students with developmental disabilities were quickly able to learn a new leisure activity that is suited to their age and the growth of technology with that age group. And giving the students choice in participating in what reinforcers was key to their success. So they didn't have the students do this experiment if they didn't agree to do it. And the reinforcers, in the sense that the videos they got to be put on their iPods, they decided. So I think Jim decided sports videos. One of the girls wanted educational videos, so that was up to them. Which is highly motivating for them to choose their own videos. And the use of VM in this study was shown the suitable range of complex skills it could be useful for. So the author mentioned how this could go beyond if these students were at the library and they couldn't figure out how to find a book and check it out. They could use this video modeling to show them the steps and be able to do things outside of school and on their own. So what we learned is that leisure skills with technology, especially in our world today where so much technology is used, promotes that sense of community inclusion in a constructive way of free time for those with intellectual disabilities. And this kind of reminded me of when I worked at Life Prep, and I know Jess does. I think a lot of the students enjoy having that connection with us through whether it's Instagram or Snapchat or whatever they can do on their phone. They see us doing it and they can do it too. They show us videos on their phone. They follow us through social media. So it makes them feel included and gives them something to do in their leisure time. And as future healthcare providers, we learned how simple intervention techniques such as video modeling and giving that reinforcement can lead to successful learning. And we also said when selecting leisure or communication devices, we must also keep proper seating and positioning in mind. So this, we went back to Mary again, who had CP, and she had a hard time holding the iPod. So we said maybe placing it in front of a stand could help her better access the iPod.
So we have some questions for you guys. So the first one is, what learning style did the researchers use to educate the students, and do you think this was effective? So there's just to remind you those styles. And this was, think back to that least to most prompting that I mentioned. So if you guys want to use the chat or just shout out, either way works. And I can't see the chat if someone wants to look.
Yep, I'm
Okay.
watching it now if anyone does it.
Anybody have any ideas for that question?
I mean, if just to give any like hint, or oh, we got one.
Yeah,
Okay,
like I know you do.
okay, we said when we were talking this over, we said kinesthetic as well, because they did have like hand over hand prompting if they needed it.
And we said visual too, with watching the video, and then auditory would be those verbal prompts. So we thought they did a really good job at touching on all those different styles.
Mm-hmm.
So really they were using more of a multimodal style.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our second question is, what theory does this study connect with most that you remember learning in theories, and why do you think so? If I can give a hint, if no one has answered yet, and maybe not why. Oh, yes, what model? Okay, good, Grace, Moho. We said Moho as well. Picking their own video, they got choice in participating in the activity altogether. So we agreed that Moho is one that we found most important.
And then our last question is, could this be translated across different age groups? So would younger children and or older adults similarly benefit from as the students in this study did? Is this something that we could do with any age group?
I think it would depend if older adults wanted to watch videos and use an iPod.
Okay. Anybody else?
Abby kind of cut out for me, but I think honestly, like, it probably could. I think you just need to take into consideration how like high tech like an iPod would be, and if younger kids or older adults would kind of understand the technology alone behind it. But I think it could definitely work across the age groups.
Yeah, that's kind of what we said, along with, again, emphasizing our authors. Wow, I can't talk today, guys. Sorry. The author's point that leisure is important in every stage of life. So, like Jordan said, if they were able to use the technology, it could be a great resource because, I mean, there's endless videos on the internet, so you could fit it to whatever interests each person had for videos that could be loaded onto the iPod for them. And then our last thing, so the levels of evidence, we said it was a quantitative study, level 3, which is known as a quasi-experimental study, because they were testing variables for change. So Jess talked about the independent and dependent controlled variables that they addressed in the study, and their overall goal was to change the skills the students had to allow them to participate in the leisure activities.
And there's our references.
Thank you, guys. Good job. And I think, you know, this study is a little bit older. Obviously, that's why they're talking about an iPod. I don't know if anybody uses iPods anymore, but you could certainly replace iPod with iPhone or iPad, or which is probably more what is used nowadays. I think it's really super interesting to think about this technology, especially in the situation that we're in right now, right? So, like, as you guys were going through this article, I was starting to think about, you know, my kids are at home right now using technology to, like you guys are, right, for their education and for school. But what is it like for students that have developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities that maybe beforehand weren't able to access or didn't know how to access the technology? So how is that really impacting you know, the delivery of, you know, sort of their education? And then I also was thinking about sort of on the other end of it that, you know, like you were talking about older adults. So my parents, who are in their 70s, are learning about Zoom and Skype and, you know, things that they've never done before because, you know, they're isolating at home, and but they still want to see us. So we're trying to help them and teach them through technology how to use the technology. So I think it's just really interesting to think about it, even like at a bigger lens of sort of what's going on right now, because we all are certainly using and relying on technology so much more than we were before. And even people that weren't using technology before this are probably, again, learning and using technology more than they were before. A couple of highlights. So, you know, the piece again, and I've said this all along in this semester, and they highlighted that in this article, is teaching the individual how to use the technology. So that was sort of the focus of this article, because a lot of the research out there about leisure is more about offering opportunities to people in an adaptive way or through assistive technology for leisure, but not necessarily teaching them how to use the technology. And if you go back and you look at the article, and the students showed how many sort of practice sessions that each student needed to have before they were successful in being able to use the iPod without prompting or assistance. And I think the highest one was somewhere up in the 30s or something like that, right? So that's just a really good, you know, way for you guys to see like how much teaching might need to be involved. Now, these are individuals with, you know, what they say sort of severe intellectual disabilities. But right, that's a long teaching process, not just a couple of sessions, right? We're talking, you know, up into the 30s of practicing. So you can see along that line where maybe somebody might abandon that and say it's just not the right technology for this person. But in reality, they just needed the time to learn how to use the technology. And that's a lot of reasons out there why equipment and technology is abandoned, is because they didn't really learn how to use it. So that's a good example of that. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was some of the terms that they use in this article. We will talk a lot about next year in your senior year. So prompting and modeling is something that you will be using in your interventions with people, especially with people that have some cognitive issues or cognitive impairments, right? And they also use the term of least to most prompting. So it's very important, and you can see in this article in their research how they very specifically structured the prompting that they were using, right? Trying to start with the least prompt, and then, you know, sort of moving down the type of prompts that they were giving until they were successful, and then fading those prompts away. That's exactly what you would be doing in a session if you're working with somebody with a cognitive impairment, it's very similar if you were working somebody from a physical perspective and you were physically assisting them, right? You're going to start with not the most assistance that you can possibly give them, but you're going to find that area, that level of assistance that you're giving them just enough that they need, right? And then you're going to start fading your assistance away, right? If you think like from strengthening, range of motion in somebody's arm, I'll go back to kinesiology, is usually the easiest way, right? So if you're helping like active assisted range of motion with shoulder flexion, you're going to fade that assistance that you're giving away from a physical standpoint, right, to increase their range of motion and strength independently. Same thing from a cognitive perspective, right? So you might start with Mary, right, in that article, who needed the physical prompts. And I know you said she needed it for physical reasons, but let's say she needed it for cognitive reasons. So that's the most assistance that you can give somebody from a cognitive perspective, is like hand over hand. I'm showing you, we're going through a hand over hand, showing you what you do, what you need to do, and then you're going to fade away, right? So then maybe it would be modeling, then it would be pointing, visual cues, and it's verbal cues. Verbal cues, right, is like the least amount of assistance that you're giving somebody. Does that make sense? So when you go into your sessions next year, like we want to see, and we want you to understand that your cueing or your assistance or your prompting needs to be, you need to think about how you're assisting or prompting or helping your client in a structured way, and then how you're fading your assistance, because of course the goal is for them to do what it is that you want them to do without you there anymore. So that's, something that, we'll spend more time talking about it, but it's a really good introduction to that idea that that you really have to pay attention. And we'll be in the sessions with you, and you'll hear me say, okay, okay, Jess, that's enough. Zoop, stop talking, or right, or take your hands off, no more hand over hand. Right now, let them, try, or just model this time, right? So, we'll do a lot of that next year in your sessions, and sort of learning how to structure your prompts or your assistance. Any questions? I hope that makes sense, right? And again, that article, if you guys take a look at it, it's a really good example of using we call it the system of least prompts. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk quickly about leisure and play adaptations. Start from the beginning here. Okay, so all about leisure activities, and they talked about in the article again that freedom of choice is the most important thing about leisure activities, and that person has a sense of control and they have a sense of enjoyment. That's the the main factor of leisure activities, that you are choosing to do it and you have control over it, and you enjoy doing that. One of the important things I want to talk to you about here is when we are documenting about leisure activities, like next year, when you're documenting, we use the term leisure for adults, right? And we use the term play for kids. Okay, so, recreation activities, from the pediatric standpoint, we call it play. And from the adult standpoint, we call it leisure. Now, in adolescence, you could probably argue the term either way, right? They play sports, but maybe they have a leisure activity that's a hobby where they go fishing or something like that. But it's something that I find myself talking to the seniors about when they're documenting play versus leisure. So that's just one way to think about using those words. And about play, right? The importance of play for kids. You learn that in development practice, in human development. So what I do want to bring your attention to is that the United Nations Convention, right, does have an international treaty on the rights of children to play, right? So that it is Article 31 of the UN Convention, right, that they have the right to rest and leisure. And this really came out of, a lot of countries that, that children are working at very young ages and, working on farms or in factories or, whatever they're doing, and that they are, missing out on a lot of play and developmental activities that could be happening. So it really sort of is this international sort of global push from the United Nations to, make sure that kids at least have some level of play in their childhood. And the other important thing to think about, again, like I said before, at the end, like towards the end of the semester, I'd like to try to get back to sort of low tech, simple, sort of basic adaptations. Right? As we go through the semester, we get into very high technology kind of stuff. But I like to sort of bring it back around to very simple, low tech types of modifications and adaptations is where we will spend most of our time in most settings as OTs in your career. So leisure activities are very easily modified by items that are readily available in most environments. And so there's a lot of different examples on here. I'm not going to go through everything. Again, last semester and this semester, part of my purpose here, or what I want to try to do for you guys, is just to expand your ideas of how to modify things or how to change things. So here's, some examples in different categories that you can take a look through, maybe some things that you haven't thought of before. Like using a lazy Susan for art supplies, or, portion controlling caps and glue sticks, things like that, or adding color to the glue so it's easier for the person to see when they're gluing on white paper, white glue. Very difficult to see. So add some food coloring in there, right? And it changes the color. And you can see that contrast. Games and play, right? Putting dice in a bottle if somebody can't hold dice in their hand, or in a cup. Again, just different examples of things that maybe you haven't thought of before. All the way up into like performing arts. Okay, so. And I just wanted to go, again, I'm not going to go through details here. You guys did the certified inclusivity assessment last semester, which students hadn't done in the past. So I don't feel like we have to go through in details, right? Guidelines for recreation facilities. There are ADA guidelines. There's guidelines just a little bit more beyond sort of rec centers, which is really where a lot of the focus was for CIA. There are standards for amusement rides. There are standards for boating facilities, exercise machines, fishing piers, golf facilities, all those types of things out there. And then again, here's some examples, right? So not all inclusive, but different ways that you can see that things that recreation places are required to provide for accessibility. This video here, the purpose of this video here, and you guys can watch it on your own. This is a gentleman that uses a wheelchair. I don't think he says in the video why he uses the wheelchair, but he does extreme sports in his wheelchair, right? And you can go on watch, and he goes on skate ramps and does everything that you would see somebody do on a bike or on a skateboard, or different types of equipment. He does in a wheelchair, and you see him flip and fall and crash and do all the types of things that somebody would do, again, that was involved in extreme sports. And the whole purpose of introducing this is, again, people have that choice, right, for their leisure activity. And like as an OT and healthcare provider, like you watch this video and you're like, ooh, no, don't do that. Oh my gosh, you're already, have some physical limitations. You really want to, do this crazy sport where you might break your arm or break your leg, and then you're going to be physically limited more. Well, he has that choice, right? Just like we have a choice if somebody else wanted to do, extreme biking or extreme skateboarding, he also has the same choice out there. So, and then here's some information about playgrounds. Again, very more specific information than you probably got from doing the CIA. Again, just very interesting type of things depending on like the number of play components that are off the ground. Depends on the number of ground level play components that the playground should have in order for it to be considered accessible by ADA. So the intent is to provide a variety of experiences for different individuals. And so there's a chart right through ADA. For example, if a playground has 5 to 7 elevated play components, they need to have at least 2 ground level play components to be considered accessible through ADA. And there has to be approachable, the approach has to be accessible to the playground as well. So that's just more information there. Again, I'm not going to go through all the specifics, very interesting. A couple of videos here to show you different types of accessible playgrounds. I know Alina is doing her inclusivity assessment project on a playground here locally that was built to be accessible in Erie County, right, Alina? Is that true? You're saying where that is?
Niagara County.
Niagara County, yes, yeah. So do you just want to talk a little bit, just like really briefly tell them about it?
Yeah, so it's called Mason's Mission, and it's founded by a family. Mason has like an undiagnosed form of hypomyelinating leukodystrophy. So they like designed the playground so it has ramps. It has a couple stairs, but there's ramps to get up there so you can avoid that. And the flooring or surfacing is all rubber. And there's like a lot of color contrast too. So each playground element has like a different color patch underneath it. And they have like rails, and like the wheelchairs can fit on the swing, or not the swings, but like those spinny things that go, I don't know what they're called, but yeah, but they just have like a wheelchair can fit on literally any of the playground elements. And then they have one section where they can like play music. So like there's like a huge xylophone, but it's all low to the ground so that anyone can reach it. And then they added onto one of the older playgrounds just by like removing the wood chips and like making a rubber path underneath the swings and stuff.
Yeah, it's cool. So again, just changing that perspective, right? So even, kids that have physical limitations should also have access to playgrounds, right? Like they should have the same ability to go out and, in their community and play with their friends and, interact with playgrounds. And, when I think about, playgrounds, when I was a kid, there was no accessibility to playgrounds, right? They were in like dirt and grass and there was no approach, and everything was elevated. There was no way kiddos that had mobility issues would be able to access playgrounds. So I think it's fantastic, again, for that community sort of leisure inclusion for play. So again, just to introduce some, I don't know if you guys have heard of Sportsnet. I can't remember if I talked about it before with you guys. So there is Sportsnet in Rochester. Rochester Rookies is one of the teams on there. It's a junior wheelchair and ambulatory sports for kids with physical limitations and cognitive limitations as well. And they do all kinds of different sports. They actually travel like sort of regionally in the Northeast coast and, go to different types of sort of like tournaments, right? Like, so a lot of you growing up probably played sports and you traveled sports and you went to tournaments. So they do the same thing with those kids. Rochester Wheels is an adult competitive wheelchair basketball, so the sled hockey, right? They have just a lot of different different types of leisure and play activities for kiddos and adults that have different types of abilities. And you guys had the pleasure of Anita O'Brien coming and talking to you about Rochester Accessible Adventures and what they have to offer. So I just wanted to end and talk a little bit about Special Olympics and Paralympics. So for those of you may know, but those of you that you don't know, the Special Olympics and Paralympics are different. So those are different events. Special Olympics is an Olympic sport that happens, at different points in time across the country, right here in the United States. We have Special Olympics here in Rochester often. Obviously, that's what the Golisano Athletic Training Center was built for. We're gonna, and we house it there, and we did it this year. And so the focus of Special Olympics is for individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. So that was sort of the mission and the goal for Special Olympics. And then Paralympics is designed and it runs the same as the Olympics. So every 2 years, right, there's an Olympics, whether it's winter or summer, and same thing, every 2 years there's a Paralympics, and it is done at the same place where they have the Olympics. So this year the Olympics was supposed to be in Tokyo, and Paralympics would have been in Tokyo at the same time. And so Paralympics is their focus, and their mission is for individuals that have physical disabilities in order to participate in Olympic sports. So there's just a lot of different types of sports that happen in Paralympics. And it's very interesting to just go through and just take a look and see how the sports are done, how they're modified, and how they're adapted for inclusion. And there's just some pictures here to show you different things like wheelchair fencing. This guy on the bottom here, this is all from the 2018 Paralympics. This dude on the bottom here that did the archery, I watched him the whole time through Paralympics. He won the gold medal in archery. It was just fascinating to watch him and how incredibly accurate he could be using his mouth and his feet with a bow and arrow. It was just really cool to see. So again, you can sort of go through and just skim through and just see, the different ways that they modify, right? So how do they modify track and field for individuals who are visually impaired, or individuals that have an intellectual disability, or individuals that have cerebral palsy, right? Things like that, or people that are missing a limb. They do have, and again, I think is fascinating, and I watched this in 2018, they have blind soccer, or they call it football, right? Blind football, right? And so how does that work? So the ball makes a sound, right? And it's for individuals that are visually impaired. And if they do have some sight, they actually have to wear a blindfold, so then they are blind. So this just gives some more information on how that happens. And obviously there's a lot more physical contact because they're using their hands to sort of feel the people around them and stuff. So again, it's just really interesting. This is soccer for individuals that have physical disabilities, specifically cerebral palsy, and sort of how they figure that out, and the level, right? Because you are learning, or you have learned in pathophysiology, that cerebral palsy is a wide range of abilities for people, and so how do they try to match the teams, right, and make sure that there isn't one team that has all high functioning players and one team that has sort of low physically functioning players. Like how do they make sure that that's works out okay? And then of course this is sort of timely because you're doing the lab with the focus of Devin, who is an engineer that adapts and makes, and works with assistive technology and adaptations. There is an engineering science behind a lot of sort of the physical adaptations and modifications, especially when you look at sort of like wheelchair sports. I mean, there's just a huge population out there, and a lot of different types of wheelchairs, and businesses that are very much focused on creating the best sort of wheelchair for wheelchair sports, which is really interesting. Like this ad here, right? So in wheelchair basketball, there's a lot of this tilt, right, where they go up on one wheel like this when they're trying to do like a quick turn, or juke somebody or whatever when they're playing basketball. And this whole point, like you tilt at 46 degrees and like you get the basket, or you tilt at 47 and you crash and the game is over, right? So it's just interesting to think about the marketing of sort of the engineering behind mobility. And then this final slide here, has anybody heard of Oscar Pistorius? This was sort of a little while ago. I think it was 2012 when he was in the Olympics. Anybody know? You can just, so Oscar Pistorius was a runner. And this is him here. He was called the Blade Runner. And he was born with legs that didn't form fully, right? So he, always used prosthesis on his legs. And then he competed in the Paralympics for many years and won, lots of medals in the Paralympics. And then in 2012, he was allowed to compete in the Olympics. And there was just a lot of, you can Google and get some information. There's a lot of controversy around him running and being able to run in the Olympics, because a lot of people felt like he actually had an advantage over individuals that didn't have these prostheses, because these specific prostheses were engineered, right, for speed, right? So there was just a lot of controversy happening there. If you do Google Oscar Pistorius, just so you know, he also was convicted of murdering his girlfriend after the Olympics. So you're probably going to get a lot of that information. But so he's currently incarcerated. He's from South Africa, so he's currently incarcerated. So you probably get a lot of information that'll pop up there. But if you weed through that, you can find a lot of information about sort of the controversy of him being able to participate in the Summer Olympics. And he really is the only person, right, with sort of a physical limitation like that, with like a prosthesis or a very specific engineered type of adaptation that has been allowed to participate in the Olympics before. So it's just an interesting story. Okay, that's my very quick sort of overview. Again, not a lot of, we're getting to the point where there's not a ton of new information for you guys, but just sort of putting it all together or sort of adding to what you've learned. Does anybody have any questions about leisure or play or Olympics or Paralympics? Okay, and I would encourage you, if you have time, again, to sort of go through some of these specifics, watch some of the videos. Like I said, it's just very interesting to see the very detailed, criteria that is involved in playgrounds and rec areas, and Paralympics and Special Olympics is really very interesting to learn more about. Cool, guys. All right, so we will end there, but just a reminder, quiz 2 due by Sunday midnight, and the lab asynchronous discussion forum due Sunday by midnight as well. And guess what? Next week is the last week of classes. Woo! You guys are almost there. You guys are doing awesome. I just have to say, you're all amazing, and keep on doing what you're doing, because you guys are doing an awesome job. Have a great weekend. Bye, guys.